In some of these fraud cases. The woman now charged in the autism program scheme is also charged in the case that put Minnesota in the national spotlight for government fraud.
Feeding Our Future became a household name, and for all the wrong reasons. 250 million taxpayers' dollars stolen from a program to feed kids during the pandemic.
$250 million.
A brazen scheme of staggering proportions.
The largest pandemic fraud in the United States.
The subjects in this case weren't interested in feeding our future. They were interested in feeding their own gluttony.
A child walks into a daycare center, hungry, waiting for lunch. The money meant to feed that child just bought a Lamborghini. $250 million, stolen from programs meant to feed hungry children during a pandemic. She claimed to be feeding 91 million meals to kids. She was feeding herself and 70 others who got caught. This is the largest pandemic fraud in American history, and it's happening in your backyard. But first, how did one woman convince the government to hand over $250 million meant for starving kids? Every massive fraud starts with a crisis and an opportunity. COVID-19 gave Aimee Bock both, but there was a warning sign nobody noticed. She'd been rejected before for the exact same thing. March 2020, the world shuts down. Schools close. Millions of children suddenly have no access to school meals. In America alone, over 20 million children depend on free school meals for nutrition. When schools closed, they went hungry. The federal government responded fast. The USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, launched emergency child nutrition programs. The rules were simple. Feed kids. Keep them from starving during lockdown. We'll reimburse you. But to speed things up, the USDA waived normal requirements. Restaurants could participate. Food could be distributed outside schools. Oversight was minimal. Aimee Bock, age 44, founder of a small Minnesota nonprofit called Feeding Our Future. On paper, Feeding Our Future looked legitimate, a sponsor organization that helps smaller groups participate in federal feeding programs. But there was something Minnesota officials already knew. Aimee Bock had applied for grant from the state of Minnesota multiple times before 2020. Every time, she was rejected. The reason? Allegations of mismanagement and abuses. In July 2019, months before COVID even existed, Minnesota Department of Education officials identified early signs of fraud. Meal claims they considered implausible. Sites claiming to serve thousands of meals in locations with no children. Invoices that didn't add up. Patterns that screamed fraud. But nobody shut it down. Then COVID hit, and suddenly, the government was desperate. Kids were hungry. Programs needed to scale fast. Oversight took a backseat to speed. Aimee Bock saw her opportunity. Between April 2020 and January 2022, Feeding Our Future exploded from sponsoring a handful of meal sites to over 200. 200 fake feeding sites, all claiming to serve meals to children. One of those sites was Safari Restaurant on Lake Street in Minneapolis, co-owned by Salim Said, age 36. Before COVID, Safari Restaurant reported about $600,000 in annual revenue, a modest restaurant serving the local community. Then, in April 2020, Safari enrolled in the child nutrition program under Feeding Our Future sponsorship. Suddenly, Safari claimed to be serving tens of thousands of meals. The restaurant that made $600,000 per year was now claiming over $16 million in federal reimbursements. Here's how the fraud worked. Step 1. Feeding Our Future recruited individuals to open fake meal sites. Daycares, restaurants, community centers. Most didn't actually exist. Step 2. These sites submitted fraudulent meal counts, claiming to serve thousands of meals per day to children who were never there. Step 3. The federal government reimbursed based on those meal counts. Money flowed into Feeding Our Future's bank accounts. Step 4. Feeding Our Future took administrative fees, over $18 million, then kicked back the rest to the fake site operators. But Aimee Bock didn't stop there. She created dozens of shell companies to hide the money. Fake consulting firms, dummy corporations, all designed to launder the stolen federal funds. And she demanded kickbacks, cash payments, bribes disguised as consulting fees. If you wanted Feeding Our Future to sponsor your fake site, you paid Aimee Bock. The total? $250 million stolen from programs meant to feed hungry children. 91 million meals claimed. Meals that were never served. Where did the money go? Lamborghinis, Ferraris, luxury homes, gold jewelry, overseas investments, private travel. During Aimee Bock's trial, prosecutors showed photos from her home. Stacks of cash, expensive jewelry, all bought with money meant for hungry kids. But here's what makes this case infuriating. Minnesota officials try to stop it. According to investigators, the state agency responsible for monitoring the program repeatedly tried to cut off Feeding Our Future's funding. They were blocked, accused of racism against the Somali American community, and the fraud continued for 2 more years. How did Aimee Bock convince an entire state to ignore the warning signs? When Minnesota officials tried to stop the fraud, they didn't face just legal challenges. They faced something more powerful, accusations of discrimination. And in 2020, those accusations could destroy careers. Summer 2020, Minnesota Department of Education officials noticed the red flags were turning into alarm bells. Sites claiming to serve 5,000 meals per day from locations with no kitchen facilities. Daycares reporting more children than existed in entire neighborhoods. Invoices with identical handwriting across different organizations. The state tried to cut off Feeding Our Future's access to federal funds. Standard procedure when fraud is suspected. Aimee Bock didn't back down. She sued the Minnesota Department of Education. Her argument? The state was discriminating against her organization because many of the meal site operators were Somali American immigrants. Minnesota has one of the largest Somali American populations in the United States. Over 87,000 Somali immigrants call Minnesota home, many refugees from civil war and famine. The community has faced real discrimination, real challenges, legitimate Somali-owned businesses and nonprofits working hard to serve their community. Aimee Bock knew this, and she weaponized it. According to prosecutors and trial testimony, Bock deliberately recruited Somali American site operators, not to help the community, but to create a shield against investigation. If the state questioned her meal counts, she'd accuse them of targeting Somalis. If they demanded documentation, she'd claim discrimination. The timing was perfect. Summer 2020. Minneapolis. George Floyd had just been murdered by police. The city was on fire. Racial justice protests swept the nation. In that environment, nobody wanted to be accused of discrimination. Nobody wanted to be labeled racist for investigating fraud. In November 2020, a federal judge ruled Minnesota could not stop payments to Feeding Our Future without providing more evidence of fraud. The money kept flowing. $200 million more over the next 14 months.
Minnesota Department of Education became suspicious in 2020 because the amount of money flowing through Feeding Our Future had gone from $3 million in 2019 to $42 million in 2020. So the Department of Ed eventually cut off funding to the nonprofit, and then the nonprofit sued them. And last year, a Ramsey County judge ruled that the Department of Ed had to start the flow of money again. And then it went up to $197 million.
While Minnesota officials gathered evidence, Aimee Bock and her co-conspirators bought more cars, more properties, more gold. Among the most prolific fraudsters was Abdikram Abdullahi Idla, a key Feeding Our Future associate. Idla operated multiple fake meal sites. According to the indictment, he claimed to serve meals at locations that didn't exist. He submitted falsified attendance rosters with names of children who were never there. And when the federal government reimbursed those fraudulent claims, Idla spent the money on luxury real estate and overseas transfers. But Idla and Bock weren't just keeping the money in America. According to prosecutors, they laundered millions overseas to Turkey, Kenya, and other countries, making it harder to trace and recover. The conspiracy grew. Other people were recruited into the scheme. Dozens more operators creating fake meal sites, all connected through Feeding Our Future, all claiming to feed children, none actually doing it. By late 2021, Minnesota officials had finally gathered enough evidence. They handed it to the FBI, and in January 2022, everything changed. What happened next would shock even the fraudsters who thought they were untouchable. The FBI doesn't raid your home unless they have overwhelming evidence. And by January 2022, they had phone records, bank statements, fake invoices, and witnesses ready to talk. 70 targets. One morning, the largest pandemic fraud bust in history. January 20th, 2022, 6 a.m., Minneapolis. Federal agents simultaneously raided over 70 locations across Minnesota. Homes, offices, restaurants, storage facilities. At Aimee Bock's home, agents seized computers, financial records, and stacks of cash. At Safari Restaurant, they found falsified meal rosters and fraudulent invoices. The FBI had been building this case for months. Wiretaps, financial analysis, witness cooperation. They seized luxury vehicles, 33 properties, millions in bank accounts, gold jewelry, designer clothing, everything bought with money meant to feed hungry children. On September 20th, 2022, the Department of Justice announced federal charges. 47 defendants. Charges including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery. The indictment alleged the defendants had stolen at least $250 million, the largest pandemic fraud scheme charged by the Department of Justice. The defendants included Aimee Bock, founder and executive director of Feeding Our Future; Abdikram Abdullahi Idla, operator of multiple fake sites; Salim Ahmed Said, Safari restaurant owner; Abdiaziz Shafii Farah, recruiter and site operator; dozens more meal site operators, consultants, and kickback recipients. The case was so large, prosecutors split it into multiple trials. Groups of 5 to 7 defendants at a time. Each trial focusing on specific schemes within a larger conspiracy. The first trial began in June 2024. 7 defendants accused of stealing over $40 million. Prosecutors showed the jury fake attendance rosters with names copied from public records. Invoices for food that was never purchased. Bank records showing luxury purchases instead of feeding children. The defense argued their clients were legitimate operators trying to help the community during a crisis. That paperwork errors were just confusion about complicated federal rules. That the government was scapegoating Somali immigrants. The jury rejected her defense. All 7 defendants, guilty on all counts. November 2024. Second trial. 5 defendants, including Abdiaziz Shafii Farah, one of the main recruiters. Prosecutors showed text messages where defendants discussed the fraud openly. Bank records showing coordinated money laundering. Witnesses who had already pleaded guilty testifying against their former partners. Again, guilty. All 5 defendants convicted. Abdiaziz Shafii Farah was later sentenced to 28 years in prison, one of the longest sentences for white-collar crime in the state's history.
Now, Abdiaziz Farah is headed to federal prison for 28 years for his role in stealing taxpayer money meant to help feed kids during the pandemic. Judge Nancy Brazel saying in court, "I cannot find any reason for the behavior other than pure unmitigated greed."
But the biggest trial was still coming. Aimee Bock, the mastermind, would face a jury in March 2025, and her defense strategy shocked everyone. The trial would last 6 weeks, and the evidence would be devastating. Aimee Bock's trial strategy was bold. Blame everyone else, play the victim, and hope the jury believes chaos isn't the same as crime. March 2025, United States versus Aimee Marie Bock. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors showed the jury emails where Bock discussed inflating meal counts, messages coordinating kickback payments, communication showing she knew sites weren't actually serving meals, bank records showing over $18 million in administrative fees paid to Feeding Our Future, money that flowed directly to Bock's personal accounts and shell companies. A timeline of luxury purchases coinciding exactly with federal reimbursement payments. New cars bought days after government checks cleared. And most damaging, witnesses. Former co-conspirators who had already pleaded guilty testified that Aimee Bock demanded cash kickbacks in exchange for sponsoring their meal sites. Aimee Bock's defense was bold. She testified in her own defense, always a risky move. Her story: she was overwhelmed. The program grew too fast. The pandemic created chaos. She trusted the site operators. She had no idea they were submitting fake meal counts. And most controversially, she claimed Somali site operators had deceived her. She portrayed herself as a victim of fraud by the very people she had recruited. Prosecutors destroyed her testimony on cross-examination. They showed her emails where she discussed the fraud knowingly. Text messages coordinating false documentation. Bank records showing luxury purchases she claimed never happened. They confronted her with her own words. Internal communications where she told site operators how to inflate numbers. Instructions on creating fake attendance rosters. Discussions about hiding the fraud from state investigators. The jury deliberated for 5 days. March 29, 2025. Guilty. Aimee Marie Bock, convicted on all counts. Wide fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, bribery. She faces up to 50 years in federal prison. Sentencing is scheduled for later in 2025.
Good evening, I'm Rena Sargentopoulos. Thank you for joining us. Aimee Bock and Salim Syed will stay in the Sherburne County Jail until they're sentenced.
Volumes. A 5-week trial decided in 5 hours as the jury rejected the testimony of former Feeding Our Future Executive Director Aimee Bock and former Safari restaurant owner Salim Syed and convicted them on all charges.
All too often, our state has been known for fraud. And the Feeding Our Future case has come to symbolize the problem of fraud in our state. It has become the shame of Minnesota. Hopefully, today's verdict will help turn the page on this awful chapter in our state's history.
Assistant U.S.
But the prosecution are not over. As of January 2026, the Department of Justice has charged about 77 defendants in connection with the Feeding Our Future fraud. Dozens more await trial. Some defendants have fled the country. Others are negotiating plea deals. The sentences have been severe. Many defendants received over 20 years in federal prison. Tens of millions in restitution ordered. Abdiaziz Farah has been sentenced to 28 years for his role in stealing taxpayers' money meant to help feed hungry kids during the pandemic. Abdikram Abdullahi Idla received 23 years for operating multiple fake sites. The message from federal judges was clear. Stealing from programs meant to feed hungry children during a pandemic warrants the harshest penalties. But here's the harsh reality. Of the $250 million stolen, federal authorities have recovered about $50 million. $200 million is still missing. Likely hidden in overseas accounts, converted to assets that can't be traced or already spent. And the children who actually needed those meals, they never got them. The fraud is solved, but the damage remains. The Feeding Our Future fraud didn't just steal money. It destroyed trust in programs meant to help vulnerable communities, gave ammunition to politicians who want to cut social services, and left legitimate organizations struggling to survive. The consequences go far beyond convictions. After the Feeding Our Future scandal, the federal government completely overhauled child nutrition program oversight. New verification requirements, mandatory site visits, enhanced financial auditing, background checks for all sponsor organizations. The changes were necessary, but they also made it harder for legitimate small organizations to participate. The biggest victims? Legitimate Somali American organizations that actually serve their community. According to community leaders, after the Feeding Our Future scandal, they faced increased scrutiny, delayed payments, and suspicion from government agencies. Aimee Bock had weaponized claims of discrimination to protect her fraud. When it was exposed, it made real discrimination harder to fight. Legitimate organizations saying, "We're being treated unfairly," now face the response. That's what Feeding Our Future said too. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who was later selected as the Democratic vice presidential candidate in 2024, faced questions about how the fraud happened under his administration's watch. Republican opponents used Feeding Our Future as evidence of Democratic mismanagement. Campaign ads featured hungry children and luxury cars. And now, in January 2026, the Trump administration has announced renewed investigations into how Minnesota officials handled early warnings about Feeding Our Future. The question, did state officials ignore red flags for too long because they feared being called racist? Feeding Our Future was the largest, but not the only pandemic fraud. According to federal estimates, over $200 billion in COVID relief funds were stolen through various fraud schemes. Fake businesses, inflated employee counts, entirely fabricated operations claiming pandemic relief. The Paycheck Protection Program, unemployment insurance fraud, small business loans. Fraudsters exploited the same vulnerabilities. Fast implementation, minimal oversight, desperation to help people during crisis. The question is, did we learn anything? The next crisis might come. Another pandemic, a natural disaster, an economic collapse. And when it does, will the government have systems in place to help people quickly without enabling massive fraud? But the saddest part? The children Feeding Our Future claim to serve are still hungry. According to Feeding America, nearly 14 million children in the United States face food insecurity. Programs meant to help them are now harder to access because of increased restrictions after the fraud. Real organizations feeding real children struggle with the stigma created by Aimee Bock's fraud. The $250 million stolen could have fed millions of meals. Instead, it bought Lamborghinis. So what do we take away from the Feeding Our Future fraud? Every crisis creates opportunities for good people to help and for bad people to exploit. We want government to act fast during emergencies, to cut through bureaucracy and help people who need it. But speed without oversight invites fraud. We want to fight discrimination and protect vulnerable communities. But that righteous goal can be weaponized by criminals who hide behind it. And we want justice. Aimee Bock and 90 others have been charged. Many will spend decades in prison. But the $250 million stolen, most of it is gone forever. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Minnesota officials saw them. They tried to stop it. They were blocked. In our rush to help, to avoid discrimination, to move fast during crisis, we ignore the obvious. And children paid the price. This is Exposure Bureau, where we expose the most audacious frauds that hide in plain sight. For more stories, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. And tell me, how do we balance speed and oversight during emergencies? Should Minnesota officials face consequences for not stopping this sooner? Let me know in the comments. Aimee Bock claimed to feed 91 million meals to hungry children. She fed 0. But she fed herself very well.